It was late afternoon, the golden light of the sun spilling over the quiet suburban street, when I noticed my neighbor, Evelyn, standing by her garden. She was pruning her roses, her usual calm, meticulous movements showing no sign of hurry. At 65, Evelyn had an air of timeless elegance about her, always composed, always graceful. She lived alone in the house next door, her husband having passed a few years back. Despite her age, she still carried herself with poise, and there was something about her presence that always drew my attention. I had moved into the neighborhood a couple of months ago, and Evelyn had been the first to welcome me, offering a kind smile and some fresh-baked cookies. Over time, our interactions became a bit more frequent, small chats in the driveway, exchanging pleasantries as we passed each other on the street. There was something comforting about her, something that made me feel at ease in this unfamiliar place. That day, as I stepped out to take the trash to the curb, Evelyn waved at me from across the yard. Her expression was warm, but there was a hint of something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Hey there," she called, her voice soft yet carrying effortlessly across the lawn. "Do you have a moment?" I walked over, curious. "Of course, Evelyn. What's up?" She set down her shears and wiped her hands on her apron, looking up at me with an almost tentative smile. "I was wondering if you could help me with something in the basement. I've got some old boxes down there that I've been meaning to go through, and I could use an extra pair of hands. I'd really appreciate it." Her request seemed innocent enough, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation. Maybe that made me pause. I had no reason to say no, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind her simple request. "Sure," I replied, nodding. "I'd be happy to help." She smiled, a little more relaxed now, and motioned for me to follow her inside. As we walked into her house, the air felt different, warmer, closer. Her home was beautifully kept, filled with antique furniture and framed photos of her family. It felt lived in, but quiet, almost too quiet. The silence between us was heavy, though I wasn't sure why. We descended the stairs into the basement, the cool air wrapping around us as we reached the bottom. The basement was dimly lit, with only a single window letting in the fading light of the evening. Evelyn gestured to a stack of old boxes in the corner, some covered in dust, others neatly labeled. "These," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if the basement itself demanded a softer tone. "I've been meaning to sort through them for ages, but, well, you know how it is. Some things are hard to face." Her words lingered in the air, and I glanced at her, noticing the way her gaze seemed to be distant, her thoughts somewhere else entirely. "I can imagine," I said gently, moving toward the boxes. "It's hard to let go of the past sometimes." She nodded, but didn't say anything more as she began opening one of the boxes. We worked in silence for a while, the sound of cardboard scraping and the soft rustle of old papers the only noise in the room. I couldn't help but steal glances at her every now and then, noticing the way her hands moved carefully, the way she seemed lost in thought. After a few minutes, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You remind me a bit of him, you know." I looked up, caught off guard. "Who?" "My husband," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Not in appearance, but in the way you carry yourself. There's a kindness in you that he had." Her words caught me off balance. I hadn't known her husband, but hearing her speak of him in this quiet, intimate space felt strangely significant. "I'm flattered," I said, unsure of how else to respond. She didn't look at me, her attention still on the box in front of her, but there was a softness in her voice when she continued. "He was a good man. Strong but gentle. I miss him." The emotion in her voice tugged at something deep inside me, and for the first time I felt the weight of her loneliness, her quiet grief. I didn't know what to say, so I reached out, my hand resting on her arm, a simple gesture of comfort. She froze for a moment, her breath catching, and when she finally looked up at me, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A vulnerability, a longing that I hadn't seen until now. "Evelyn," I began, my voice trailing off, unsure of what I was trying to say. But before I could finish, she moved closer, her hand reaching up to touch mine where it rested on her arm. Her fingers were warm, her touch gentle, but the weight of it sent a jolt through me, something I hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I replied quickly, my heart racing. "You didn't at all." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, the air between us charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. We stood there, close, too close, and I could feel the pull between us, the way her gaze lingered on mine, as if waiting for something to happen. But it couldn't. It shouldn't. She was my neighbor, and more than that, she was grieving, still holding on to the memory of her husband. And yet, in that moment, it felt like something was shifting between us, something that neither of us could control. Evelyn's hand lingered on mine for a moment longer than it should have, and I could feel the subtle tremor in her fingers as if she was grappling with the same conflict that was now flooding my mind. There was something incredibly intimate about the way we were standing, the small basement space amplifying the tension between us. I didn't know how to move forward. I could feel the weight of what was happening, the way we were both standing at the edge of something neither of us had expected. My hand stayed where it was, resting lightly on her arm, but the moment felt heavy, charged with a kind of intensity that was difficult to describe. Evelyn's eyes met mine, and for the first time I noticed the depth of emotion behind them. There was sadness, of course, grief that hadn't fully healed, but there was also something else, a longing, a need for connection that had nothing to do with words. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked softly, trying to break the silence, even though I already knew the answer. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, her gaze shifting downward as if she was trying to gather her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," she admitted, her words filled with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I thought those feelings were behind me. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "Evelyn." She looked up at me again, her eyes filled with a kind of sadness that I couldn't ignore. "I don't want to do anything that would make you uncomfortable," she said softly. "But there's something between us, isn't there?" Her words hit me like a wave, crashing over the carefully built walls I had been trying to maintain. She had voiced what I had been trying to deny, what I hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge. There was something between us, something that had been quietly building over the weeks we had known each other. It wasn't just the casual conversations in the driveway or the fleeting glances exchanged as we passed each other on the street. It was deeper than that, a connection that neither of us had expected but couldn't ignore. I couldn't deny it any longer. "There is," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion, "but I don't know what to do about it." Evelyn's gaze softened, and for a moment, the sadness in her eyes seemed to lift, replaced by something warmer, something more hopeful. She took a small step closer, and the space between us felt even smaller now, the air thick with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "I don't either," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "but I can't pretend it's not there." Her hand moved then, sliding up my arm in a slow, deliberate motion, and the warmth of her touch sent a shiver down my spine. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried with it so much weight, so much unspoken emotion. I could feel the heat of her body so close to mine, the subtle brush of her skin against my arm, and it made it hard to think clearly, hard to remember why this was wrong. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing as I looked down at her. "Evelyn, I don't want to take advantage of you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You're still grieving." "I know," she said quickly, cutting me off, "I know that. But it's not about that, it's about." This she gestured between us, her fingers brushing lightly against my chest, as if to emphasize the connection that was pulsing between us. I felt my resolve slipping further, the line between right and wrong blurring as the tension between us grew. Her hand was still on my chest, her fingers tracing slow, gentle patterns against my shirt, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the pull I felt toward her. "I don't know if this is a good idea," I said, my voice faltering. Evelyn's eyes softened, and she took another step closer, her body now just inches from mine. "Maybe it's not," she whispered, "but sometimes we have to let ourselves feel something, even if it's complicated." Her words hit me hard, and I couldn't deny the truth in them. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but my body was already reacting, already responding to the closeness, the warmth, the intensity of the moment. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand resting gently on her waist. Her breath caught, and I could feel the subtle tremble that passed through her as our bodies connected. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me, her forehead resting lightly against my chest, and the intimacy of the gesture made my heart ache. We stood like that for a long moment, neither of us saying anything, just letting the weight of the moment settle over us. I could feel the rise and fall of her breath, the warmth of her body pressed against mine, and it was almost overwhelming, the closeness, the vulnerability, the unspoken understanding between us. When she finally lifted her head to look up at me, her eyes were filled with a kind of quiet longing that made my chest tighten. There was no turning back now. The line between us had already been crossed, and we both knew it. "I want this," she whispered, her voice so soft I could barely hear it. "I want you." Her words sent a jolt through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned down, my lips brushing against hers in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was a kiss filled with hesitation, with uncertainty, but also with a deep, unspoken desire that had been building between us for far too long. Evelyn responded instantly, her hands sliding up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. The softness of her lips, the warmth of her body pressed against mine, it was all too much, and yet not enough. I wanted more. I needed more. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her flush against me as the kiss grew more intense, more desperate. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken feelings between us were pouring out into this moment, and there was no stopping it now. Her hands moved up my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my muscles, and I could feel her body responding to mine, her breath quickening as the intensity between us grew. Every touch, every kiss felt like it was setting my skin on fire, and I couldn't get enough of her. But there was still a part of me that was holding back, still a part of me that knew we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This was more than just physical, it was emotional, deeply emotional, and I knew that once we let ourselves go, there would be no turning back. I pulled back slightly, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked down at her. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly swollen from our kiss, and the way she was looking up at me with so much vulnerability, so much longing made it impossible to resist. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely audible, though I already knew the answer. Evelyn nodded, her hand coming up to cup my cheek as she looked into my eyes. "I've never been more sure." That was all I needed to hear. I kissed her again, this time with more urgency, more need. Her hands slid down my back, pulling me closer as we moved together, our bodies pressing against each other in a way that felt both natural and forbidden. The world outside the basement faded away, leaving just the two of us, tangled in each other, lost in a moment that neither of us had expected but both of us wanted. As the kiss deepened, the room around us seemed to vanish, leaving only the warmth of our bodies, the quiet intensity of the moment. My hands roamed down Evelyn's back, pulling her closer, feeling the softness of her skin beneath my fingers. There was a tenderness in the way we touched, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion, it was something more, something neither of us could have predicted. Evelyn responded with the same urgency, her hands running up my arms, her breath hitching as our kiss grew more intense. The weight of everything we had been holding back for so long was pouring into this one moment, and it was impossible to stop it now. Every touch, every kiss felt like it was igniting something deep inside of us, something that had been lying dormant, waiting to be awakened. Her body trembled against mine, and I could feel the mixture of vulnerability and desire in the way she pressed herself closer, her fingers tangling in my hair, as if she needed to hold on to something solid in the whirlwind of emotions swirling between us. It was overwhelming, the closeness, the rawness of the connection between us. We moved together, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every second, every sensation. Her lips parted against mine, a soft sigh escaping her as I kissed the curve of her neck, my hands exploring the gentle rise and fall of her back. There was something so fragile and yet so powerful in the way we held each other, and I could feel the weight of all the unspoken words between us, the unacknowledged feelings that had quietly grown over the weeks of knowing her. But even as we gave in to the moment, there was an undercurrent of hesitation, a quiet reminder that what we were doing wasn't just about physical attraction. There were emotions involved, emotions that had the power to complicate things in ways neither of us could fully grasp yet. Evelyn pulled back slightly, her breath coming in soft, uneven gasps as she looked up at me. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and uncertainty, and for a moment we simply stood there, caught between what we wanted and what we knew was right. "I don't know where this is going," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to stop." Her confession hit me hard, and I could feel the same conflict rising in my chest. I wanted her, there was no denying that, but there was so much more at play here, so much that could be lost if we weren't careful. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," I said softly, my hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We can take it one step at a time." Evelyn's gaze softened, and she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I don't want to lose what we have." "You won't, I promised," though even as I said the words, I knew that things had already changed between us. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and we would have to face the consequences of that eventually. But for now, we stayed in the moment, wrapped in each other, allowing ourselves to feel everything we had been holding back for so long. There was no more hesitation, no more second guessing. This was what we both wanted, and for now, that was enough. The air in the basement felt warmer, heavier, as we continued to explore each other in quiet, intimate movements. Every touch, every kiss felt like it was deepening the connection between us, and I could feel the quiet desperation in the way Evelyn's hands moved over my skin, as if she was trying to memorize every inch of me, to hold on to this moment as tightly as possible. We were both caught in the same storm of emotions: desire, fear, uncertainty, and yet, in this moment, all of it seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of us, alone together in the quiet of the basement. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our bodies still pressed close together as we stood in the fading light of the room. Evelyn's hands rested on my chest, her fingers lightly tracing the lines of my muscles, and I could feel the subtle tremble in her touch, as if she was trying to hold on to the last remnants of the moment before reality set back in. Her eyes met mine, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, the weight of what we had just shared settling over us. It was intimate, yes, but it was also deeply complicated, and the reality of that was starting to sink in. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where we go from here." Neither did I. There was no easy path forward, no clear answer to what we were supposed to do now. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences of that would ripple out in ways neither of us could predict. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. "We'll figure it out," I said quietly, my hand gently cupping her cheek. "One step at a time." Evelyn nodded, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe me, and maybe I wasn't sure either. But for now, all I knew was that I didn't want to lose what we had, whatever it was. Slowly, she stepped back, her hand slipping from mine as the space between us widened. The moment was over, but the connection remained, lingering in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. "I should probably head upstairs," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "It's getting late." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of what we had done still hung in the air, and I knew that once she walked out of this basement, everything would change. We couldn't go back to the way things were, not after this. Evelyn turned and began to walk toward the stairs, her footsteps soft against the concrete floor. But just before she reached the top, she paused, glancing back at me over her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible, "for being here." I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. "Anytime, Evelyn." And with that, she disappeared up the stairs, leaving me alone in the quiet of the basement, the echoes of our shared moments still hanging in the air. I stood there for a long time, my thoughts racing, my emotions swirling in a way that I couldn't quite grasp. There was no clear resolution, no easy way forward, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same between us again.